cementing a security alliance. Leaders of the United States, Japan and South Korea agreed to shore up relations in the Asia-Pacific. Washington says it's not about China, but is anyone convinced? And what does it all mean for the region? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. A new era of cooperation. That's how US President Joe Biden has described his meeting with the leaders of South Korea and Japan at Camp David in Maryland. The three heads of state pledged to deepen their security partnership in the Asia-Pacific. The meeting seen as a bid to project unity in the face of China's growing influence in the region and nuclear threats from North Korea. Beijing has denounced the summit and within hours had carried out drills in Taiwanese waters. Taiwan accused China of intimidation, while Japan, South Korea and the US condemned its dangerous and aggressive actions. So, South Korea and Japan are neighbours, but they've never been friends. For decades, they've struggled to overcome deep historical grievances. Let's look at the geopolitical tensions that brought them together. The biggest concern is China's growing influence, and that includes the Taiwan issue. Beijing claims the island as its own territory and has not ruled out force to take it. The Chinese military holds drills in the Taiwan Strait and enters Taiwanese airspace, which Taipei says is intimidation. South Korea and Japan also accuse Beijing of aggressive behaviour in territorial disputes in the East and South China Seas. Then there's North Korea and its increasingly frequent weapons tests. Some missiles have landed in Japanese waters and it's accused of flying drones into South Korean airspace. We'll discuss this with our guests in just a few moments, but first, this report from Cara Legg.
History in the making. A moment unimaginable a few decades ago, the first official meeting between the three heads of state, and a sign of improved relations between South Korea and Japan. The US president praised the pair for what he called their political courage.
Seem like I'm happy, it's because I am. This has been a great meeting. Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, we meet in this historic place to make a historic moment, and I believe that to be true.
Tokyo and Seoul have a long history of hostility and fraught relations since Japan's occupation of the Korean Peninsula more than a century ago. But in recent months, they've taken tentative steps towards a resolution and to strengthen ties with the US.
Thank you.
The meeting at Camp David was the first time foreign leaders have visited the presidential retreat in 8 years, an indication of how seriously the US leadership takes their relationship.
For the first time, instead of on the sidelines of multinational conferences, we have held the Trilateral Summit on a standalone basis. Numerous historical meetings have taken place here at Camp David, and it is a huge honour to have turned a page in its history with this meeting.
Today will be remembered as a historic day where we established a firm institutional basis and commitments to the trilateral partnership. Today I hope we will explore together ways to elevate cooperation between Korea, the US and Japan to a new plane through in-depth discussions.
However, some analysts say the relationship between Japan and South Korea remains politically charged. China is an important trading partner for both, and Beijing has already expressed displeasure with the summit.
No country should seek its own security at the expense of the security interest of others and of regional peace and stability. The international community has its own judgment as to who is creating contradictions and increasing tensions.
The White House says it's worked on the meeting for almost as long as President Biden has been in office. And while he's made progress where previous administrations have failed, there are concerns that with the 2024 election around the corner, any change in US leadership could bring a change of heart. Cara Legg for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests. Nancy Snow is a foreign policy advisor to the Japanese government, a professor of public diplomacy, joins us from Tokyo. In London, we have Edward Howell, who's a politics lecturer at New College, Oxford. His research focuses on East Asia security and Korean Peninsula politics. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Shirley Yoon, a senior visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. Shirley specialises in China's political economy. A warm welcome to all of you. And Edward, I'd like to start with you. So Camp David, it is a venue resonant with a history of famous negotiations, a venue that Biden describes as symbolising the power of new beginnings and new possibilities. I suppose it demonstrates just how important this is to President Biden, strengthening the US position as he sees it in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, this is an historic moment, particularly given what has been done bilaterally in terms of US relations with Japan and US relations with South Korea since the start of the Biden administration. But I think it's very important that we don't get ahead of ourselves. Yes, this is extremely significant. Yes, this is an historic moment, but there is still a very long way to go, particularly in terms of the individual bilateral relations between Tokyo and Seoul. And what this Trilateral Summit aims to try and cement is a much longer-term framework as well, so that in the event that any one of the three leaders is removed from office, loses the next election, for instance, these principles, these values, these shared commitments can still try and continue apace. And this is obviously a key concern for the Biden administration with the upcoming US election next year.
You raised lots of points there, Edward. We'll come to those over the course of the next 20 minutes or so. But Nancy, I'd like to come to you. Nancy Snow, all this might be driven by the shared perceptions of threats posed by China and North Korea, but it's complex because it's not just about security and defence.
No, and I actually thought that for this historic summit, they should have led more with economics, with sustainability, with discussion of climate change, because it was clear that it was about cooperation and collaboration, and there was a whole potpourri of issues. Biden mentioned having a youth summit amongst the three, and the trilateral emphasis was obviously in response to a trilateral competition vis-a-vis Russia, North Korea, and China. But I say economics should have been the emphasis because living as I do here in Northeast Asia, we get a little uncomfortable with an overemphasis on security. It's a dangerous neighborhood, to be sure, but the domestic populations in all three really are concerned more with the pocketbook issues. And in particular in the U.S. with the upcoming election, this could go awry. Although I am buoyed by the interest that this has incurred across at least the global media emphasis. And I just hope that the populations domestically will pay more attention to both the defense and the diplomacy aspects of living in this increasingly chaotic and complex world that we do.
Indeed. Shirley, what's your perspective? How does Beijing view this summit and its outcome?
The United States, Japan, and South Korea collectively represent 40% of the global GDP. As Nancy mentioned, if Russia, North Korea, and China were the counter parties here in terms of economic competition, I'm not sure it's even a symmetrical comparative here. So the power of the alliance is self-evident in these statistics. Now, the three parties have struck, I think, a East Asian security and economic nexus. According to the spirit of Camp David, they prioritized defense security, followed closely by discussions of economic security. But a couple of things are actually noteworthy. I thought they have toned down the rhetorics surrounding Taiwan. It says that the positions of the three countries towards Taiwan have not changed, and they support a peaceful resolution across the Taiwan Strait. And my last point is the meeting, although did not institutionalize the rise of the Asian NATO. However, with the regular heads of state, security, military meetings, and annual military drills. I think it is a de facto institutionalization of the emergence of the Asian NATO.
We'll come on to all of that. Shirley, actually, you talk about Taiwan there, but the thing is, you say they've kind of toned down the rhetoric, but within hours of the summit, China had carried out drills in Taiwanese waters.
There will be a lot of symbolic gestures, just as we remember very well when Speaker Nancy Pelosi was flying to Taiwan. So a lot of these things are going to be both symbolic and strategic in nature. They are not aimed at any physical, I don't believe, any physical or actual provocation towards Taiwan.
Edward, do you want to come back on Shirley's views there?
Yes, I mean, I think what's important is that China's rhetoric of particularly institutional arrangements as being anti-China has also been applied to AUKUS and also to the quadrilateral dialogue. I mean, I think, as Shirley's mentioned, what's key is that in the Camp David principles and in the trilateral statement, we see the US highlighting its commitment to consult in this tripartite relationship, but the bilateral relations between Washington and Seoul and Washington and Tokyo remain first and foremost paramount. And I think that's very important. I think that was a very clear gesture from Washington to ensure that it didn't want to verge into saying that this was any kind of sort of trilateral strategic alliance, or, as one might say, a de facto collective security arrangement.
But it is in effect, isn't it?
It is. What it's doing is it's highlighting, it's stepping up the comprehensive strategic alliance that the US highlighted with South Korea in the Washington Declaration earlier this year. And it's also, crucially, both a way of deterring China and North Korea regional threats, but also for the US to reassure its allies of South Korea and Japan. And I think this balance between deterrence and reassurance is particularly important and has been particularly important for the Biden administration.
Nancy, I'm sure you want to jump in on that, but I'd also ask you, you said that there is too much emphasis on security, but the point is that this summit would not have happened if it wasn't for, you know, extraordinary amounts of insecurity right around the world, aided and abetted primarily by Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Right. And that did change the paradigm for Japan when that happened. But I look at security in a broader context because Prime Minister Kishida has really emphasized growing ties with ASEAN, with the greater Asian nations. And many of them are really agnostic about the conflict, the ongoing conflict, competition, whatever we want to call it, between the U.S. and China. They want to do business with those countries that are willing to help them, not just in aid, but also in growing their GDP. And so they have a larger plate of worries, and they feel like they're getting caught up in this neo-Cold War. And Kishida, too, has an ongoing conundrum with his own population, and that you had the Hiroshima summit, the G7 recently, and Zelensky came in, and so the discussion quickly turned to Ukraine and Russia, which is an ongoing conflict, but not the only conflict. And there were some of the hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bomb, who were rather upset that this peace city that has marketed itself as an international city of peace, that was sort of lost. I would add, as a public diplomacy scholar who's long looked at Japan's nation brand, a significant portion of the Japanese people really believe strongly in their hearts in this Pacific brand, this peace brand. And so it's it's sort of threading the needle now as Japan ramps up its defense and security. I'm not saying that it doesn't need it, but it has to be careful. It has to have a marketing campaign, a public information campaign with the Japanese people, and include, of course, the Korean people in this as well.
Shirley, is the peace brand, as Nancy puts it, is it more likely or less likely following this summit?
I think in this major developments of this trilateral relationship, Japan and the United States have not really changed. What's made the moment historic is really South Korea's pivot to a historic détente with Tokyo. And so China's obviously quite caught off guard in a way by that as well. Since May. So I think from the Chinese public opinion, a lot of the talks have been driven towards South Korea's change of attitudes. And basically, China's stance is that the Korean Peninsula is essentially the enduring hallmark of the tragedy of the first Cold War. So of all countries in the region, how could South Korea, essentially the victim of the Cold War today, support Cold War 2.0?
Edward, on to you on that one.
Yes, I think that one of the key things that we've taken out from this is that this is a continuation of past efforts, particularly by the South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol in his efforts to engage in rapprochement with Tokyo. We saw this earlier in the year with quite a controversial maneuver with respect to compensating victims of forced labor and the comfort women from when Japan annexed the Korean Peninsula in the early 20th century. So this is a natural culmination of efforts, particularly by President Yoon, to try and patch up this relationship. And just to add on that point, if I may, the language that we see in the Camp David principles and the trilateral statement is very much reflective of South Korea's own Indo-Pacific strategy and South Korea's approach to value-based diplomacy and this idea of Seoul as a global pivotal state, respecting and upholding the norms of the rules-based international order.
Nancy, this détente that both are talking about, tell us a little bit more about this mutual acrimony, if we could put it that way, between South Korea and Japan, and where it stems from, briefly, if you would, and how much it has taken for both countries to at least, for now, it seems, put it behind them.
This has been remarkable. I've lived here on and off since 2012. And when I first arrived, I had no idea, really, the extent of the acrimony, the sense on the Korean side that the Japanese had not fully apologized, not only over the comfort women or sexual slavery issue, but also just in addition to the occupation of Korea for so long. And I've traveled a lot to Seoul, and I heard this firsthand. It was brought to my attention. It was not brought to my attention in Japan. It's not generally talked about in polite company. Now there's an opportunity beyond really the Camp David summit for people in this region to engage with each other more in a truth and reconciliation campaign that we all want to live more peaceably together. And perhaps this is an opportunity for that, not to gear up to go to war, but rather to come to terms with how are we going to reconcile the past with the present.
Yeah, Shirley, given the enmity between South Korea and Japan up until now, how fragile is this agreement, and how may perhaps future elections change the dynamic of this agreement?
I think the historical hostility with the atrocity that happened during the Second World War is profound in the region, and that applies not only to South Korea, but also to China. I think it just takes another Japanese prime minister's visit to the Yasukuni Shrine for the war dead for South Korea to protest against Japan again, which will make President Yoon's Camp David statement quite unpopular in South Korea. And so the reality is that Japan really never fully atoned for the World War II atrocities. We understand that it's decades ago, but in South Korea as well as in China, I think the memories is still very much alive. But at the same time, I want to say from Chinese perspective, China is not they're idly watching, this rise of security economic nexus on the East China neighborhood. China is busy at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, and just about the right time, the time when the U.S. brokered the détente between Japan and South Korea. China brokered the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And today, Saudi Arabia is being fast-tracked to become a member to the now expanded BRICS summit. So we can see as the U.S. starts to garner more support in an alliance among the industrialized economies, China is moving very fast and massively across the developing world.
Right, interesting. So, Edward, China focused on diplomacy beyond the Asia-Pacific region. Does the US focus on the Asia-Pacific region leave a vacuum elsewhere that enables China to grow its influence around the world?
On the one hand, I think you could say yes, but I think that since in the post-war era, the US has tried to remain extremely committed to its so-called ironclad allies in Japan and South Korea. And I think China is very, very aware of this. I think one of the things to bear in mind is the ongoing North Korean nuclear and missile threat, how this is being changed and playing out in the wake of the paralysis we see with the United Nations Security Council following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think the US does need to continue focusing on strengthening its economic, yes, but also security relations with its historic allies in Northeast Asia. And I think Tokyo and Seoul would want that as well. They would want that quite clearly.
Yeah, Nancy, so both Japan and South Korea in range of North Korea's missile tests. Fumio and Kishida say that North Korea, the threat is only becoming larger from North Korea. How does this summit and the agreement, how does it fit in? How does North Korea fit into all of that?
Well, North Korea continues to be the major irritant. And whenever the missile flies over Japan, the feeling of insecurity here and the support for Japan having some better capability in defense goes way up. At the same time, economic concerns are prevalent here across the region with inflation and incomes staying flat. And so people, are a little bit wavering in their public opinion. As I said, with security, we need to broaden it out. And North Korea is going to continue to do what it does. And I think the U.S. and Japan and South Korea working together, but also working within this region to try to dampen a triggering, some type of an accidental occurrence. That is probably the biggest worry rather than an intentional war breaking out. And also in what's happening in the South China Sea, it was interesting to monitor the summit and to watch the presser and how Biden really played down China. He mentioned China at the very end, but he said that this summit was more about cooperation and building cooperation in the region and less about taking on China, militarily. So we'll see how this plays out. This is not a one-off. This is supposedly going to be an annual summit amongst the three. And this could be the beginning of something really quite special. But we'll see in the context of elections how it happens.
And every time they meet, North Korea will be high on the agenda. Shirley, how does China play the North Korea card? Does everything Kim Jong-un do have China's sanction? How does it work?
It's interesting. It clearly shows in the North Korean case that nuclear is a geopolitical power because President Biden recently announced that he's willing to meet with President Kim Jong-un one-on-one without any precondition. And also today, I think President Biden made a remark that he looks forward to meeting with Chinese President Xi in the later part of the year. So now the Trilateral deal has put the U.S. in a stronger position in East Asia. And I think the next strategy is perhaps more realpolitik than ideational. I think the Biden administration's approach will be to approach both North Korea and China one-on-one to try to negotiate based on the real position of strength that it has today. But on the other point that you just mentioned about the power overreach of the United States across all regions in the world, as we know, there are many tender geopolitical spots in the world today. But there is only one United States. Using a movie's name, the U.S. cannot be everywhere and everything all at once. So there are security vacuums left in Central Asia, particularly in Afghanistan, security vacuum left in the Middle East, and now in West Africa, we're seeing in Myanmar. So China is starting to fill in a lot of the security vacuums, both with its economic footprints, but also with some levels of strategic and political presence as well. So I think if the U.S. tries to contain China within the Pacific, China is moving elsewhere in terms of developing its influence.
Edward Howell, would you like to come back on that?
Yes, if I just may say about the North Korea aspect of things, we must remember that North Korea, particularly in the statements expounded by Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong-un, has made quite clearly that it does not want to go to the negotiating table either with the US or with South Korea. And this has been a repeated feature of the state rhetoric, the regime's rhetoric, in the past weeks and months. So it's all very well and that Biden has made this outreach, but it takes two to tango. And when North Korea does not want to respond and does not want to come to the negotiating table, then we are at an impasse. And North Korea has been very adamant recently that it does not want to respond to any of the US's ploys, which is the word that it uses, and calls for negotiations. And that's something that makes the situation much harder and is something that needs to be borne in mind.
Well, very interesting discussion, everybody. Do appreciate your input. It's all we have time for, so thank you very much. Nancy Snow, Edward Howell and Shirley Yu. Thanks very much indeed. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here at Al Jazeera, it is goodbye for now.